this is a fascinating story about, oh, they're all fascinating stories, but this is a really good story about one of the Second World War's most heroic adventures, both from a personal point of view and a mechanical point of view. There's this, it's all about a Bentley. The main story is in 1940, when the Nazis invaded France, they were encircling Paris, and just as they closed the final stage of the circle to completely trap it, escaped out of that, out of Paris, came a Bentley Continental, 1937 model, with 1.5 tons of platinum strapped to its chassis. Now that platinum eventually went on to finance the Spitfires in the Free French Army later on in the war. But in 1940, this banker persuaded his fellow directors of the bank to allow him to get this bullion out of France before the Nazis seized it. The history behind it is fascinating. He was a French count who was an aristocrat, obviously, and he'd entertained the Nazis, or this German aristocrat, in 1931, I think, and they'd had a race between Paris and Cannes, between a Mercedes and a Bentley, not the same one, but and the Bentley. And extraordinarily enough, even though it was a supercharged Mercedes and everything, but the Bentley won. Anyway, in 1940, same banker with another Bentley strapped the bullion to the chassis, zoomed out of Paris with his secretary, incidentally, which is one of the reasons that he gets betrayed, but that's another story. Or no, it's a part of the same story because his wife betrayed him. But they drove eventually got to Lisbon, and a British Catalan flying boat landed at sea, picked up all the bullion, picked up the banker and his girlfriend, flew them back to London, and the bullion was used to finance the Free French. But the story of the escape has only just come to light because the bullion, the Bentley itself, is still in existence and is owned by a British Guards officer who lives in Knightsbridge. I was introduced to him via someone I met at Groucho clubs. Anyway, that's how I got it, because I was interested in this story, and he owned the Bentley. And I went to see this guy. It's extraordinary. I didn't realise anybody like this existed. You know, first I get there at 11 o'clock in the morning, he offers me a gin and tonic, and he must have done, I couldn't go near it, but he must have done a bottle of gin before we went for lunch. And it was, he owned this Bentley, and he bought it when he was an attaché, a military attaché in Lisbon, just after the war, or it was about 1960 he was there, and he saw this Bentley advertised. It was on blocks, and he bought it from the son of the guy that owned the Bentley. And when he bought the Bentley, the son of the original guy that owned the house said he was storing it for his friend, who he was convinced would return for the Bentley one day, but of course he never did. So he was selling the Bentley. Anyway, he brought it back to London, shipped it back to London, and then started to do an investigation into it, and discovered all these amazing stories about how it had left Paris and how it had arrived in Lisbon, but there was nothing in between. So he knew nothing about this. And then one day in the early 2000s, I think, someone knocked on his door and said, do you know who that Bentley is outside? And he said, yeah, it's mine. He said, because I think I was responsible for some of the bullet holes in the back of it. I was on in a squad of Germans charged with finding that Bentley, and we scoured the whole of the French countryside looking for it, and we saw it on one of the passes over the Alps, which was on one of the passes going into Spain, and we shot at it, and I shot at it, and I think I probably was responsible for one of the holes that are in the boot, and the guy did confirm that there was bullet holes in the boot of the car. So then he filled in. Then we had the story of the chase then from Paris to Lisbon, and it's an extraordinary story because he, they were strafed by fighters, and they couldn't understand how the Germans knew their route or knew where they were. But what had happened was his wife, the Countessa, had discovered that he'd done a runner with his secretary, and she was bitter, and hell hath no fury. So she said, look, he's going to take this route, and this is where he always goes. And so they eventually, because they knew everywhere they went, they were going to be discovered by the Germans. And it led to high-speed chases, and they just managed to get away. And so eventually they sleep all day and drive at night, and so that's how they managed to get down there. Anyway, they managed to get there, and back in England, both the banker and his secretary disappeared. No one knows where they went, or no one knows that part of the story, which I'd love to find out about. But the documentation is absolutely extraordinary on how this banker, and it was incidentally the guy that was the Nazi officer that was charged with finding the Bentley was the same Nazi officer that had the race with the original Bentley and the Count Emmanuel de Montague, I think his name was. They were two of the original characters, and that's why the German officer had the rapport with his wife and convinced her that he'd gone off with his secretary and that she ought to divulge the route he would take, because they'd done that journey before. So the story just developed and developed, and it's a fascinating story, and it's rather similar to the yellow Rolls Royce. There was a wonderful film made about a car that was a hero of a resistance army that was used to ferry the people around. It's rather similar to that. It's an extraordinary example of human endurance and mechanical endurance, because the Bentley outstripped the German Wehrmacht, and just a wonderful story, and it's still running today. So we want to make a program about that. So if you're interested, it's called the Bullion Bentley. Thank you.